We have another house called the Workhouse, which is right next to the studio where we make all the films that we've been making. So that's literally takes me about 12 minutes from door to door to get to work. So we have that close to where we make the movies. So, and one of the movies, such as Fantastic Beasts, that I'm making now is quite a complicated piece of work. It involves hundreds and hundreds of technicians and dozens and dozens of actors. So it's a huge, great tanker of a machine. But we've been really blessed with an extraordinary extraordinary couple of line producers, actually. And they've really guided us through in a really terrific way, make this film. And we felt very, very lucky. And to be able to lose ourselves in J.K. Rowling's world for months at a time, tell our story, joy for us. And I would say that pre-Potter, before I started to do these bigger Warner Brothers movies with Joe, and my style was very much defined by a verite camera work, jump cuts in editing. So it was a very contemporary style of filmmaking, which I loved. For me, it was all about authenticity, finding a moment that felt truly authentic. Because if the audience truly believed the moment, it heightens everything. And so therefore, the aesthetic of the sound and the camera movement and the editing always tried to make things feel very much in the moment. And then when I entered Joe's world and started exploring Potter, there's a heightened reality. And I would say that for the past 15 years, I guess I've been in that sort of world of storytelling that's slightly more expressive and classical. And I've enjoyed that very, very much. But my natural storytelling style is actually slightly removed from that in a weird kind of way. And I would describe it as much more sort of visceral and in the moment, rather than heightened and expressive, which is what I tend to naturally do with the Beasts films and the Potters. So I don't think you could sort of necessarily label me one thing or another, because I've dipped in both, I guess. And I'm looking forward at some point soon to returning to that sort of more natural style that I quite enjoy doing. I loved all of Ken Loach's work and the sort of feeling of truth and authenticity that you feel when you watch a Ken Loach film. And from a stylistic point of view, I always loved Scorsese and his use of jump cuts and freeze frames and his expressive use of sound. So those, when I was growing up, even though they're at two ends of the spectrum, were the sort of filmmakers that I really enjoyed watching and that inspired me. And ultimately what I try and do is express story, rather than have a specific style. I'm always wanting to honor the story, honor the moment, find a lens or find a sound or find a piece of music or find an angle where I put the camera that in a way expresses that moment in the most interesting way. So in one film I can have, as I did with some of the Potters or even Beast 3 now, there'll be handheld camera work in one scene and then sort of classic sort of wide lens shots in another that are sort of still and hardly move. So it depends what serves the moment, I guess. So that's the rule of thumb I've been following. Whatever expresses the moment for the story at that particular point is what I've observed. I just finished a TV show called Sex Traffic for Channel 4. So when my agent phoned up and said they'd love you to think about directing Harry Potter, it seemed like a sort of incongruous fit. And I went to meet David Heyman as a producer, and I was just curious as to why they were asking me on board. And part of the thing that was happening with the stories is they were going a little darker and more intense. And they wanted a filmmaker to come in and sort of honor that and to sort of help the actors grow into that sort of slightly more grown-up version of the story, that as Joe continued with the books, they were going a little bit more darker and more intense. And so it felt very natural to me to step in and start to encourage the actors and start to encourage the writers to kind of get a bit more intense, because that's the landscape I'd come from. And actually arriving was like arriving to play with a huge train set. It was like this extraordinary sort of playpen to just jump into. And the studio and the producers were amazingly supportive. They were very keen for me to just do my thing. There was no mandate or sort of rule of how you did anything. They just said, we love your work. Come and do what you do, but come and do it here. So, and that's been pretty much the case now for 15 years, I guess, through the Potters and through the Beast movies. We've continued that relationship, and I've always loved Jo's world for its obviously its magical qualities, but for me what's really powerful and wonderful about it is she explores interesting emotional stories through that prism of magic. And I love the idea that, we can tell stories that, have all these extraordinary magical things in them, but which are actually about abuse or politics or, or power or all the things that are really quite important in many ways to the stories that we should be telling, or telling them in a magical universe. And it's a great privilege to be able to do that and know that when you make one of these films, they're seen by audiences all over the world across all these different cultures. It was relatively easy to step into that world. I was encouraged to do my thing. I was encouraged to sort of help the world grow up into a more mature place. And I found that very easy because it was within my wheelbase to do that. My only focus, so I was very focused on just making the best film I could possibly make. And that often meant you were leaving things out that were in the book that sort of bumped in the screenplay, because there's only so much you can contain in the screenplay to sort of make it an immersive experience for the audience. And I can't really convey as basically the crew, the cast, my producers, the studio were so supportive and embracing of what I brought in. I never felt any pressure. Actually, it's strange. I never felt any. So for the only time I really felt it was when I finished that first Potter. I went to the premiere and it was nuts. It was like there were thousands of people outside the cinema, and there were people screaming, and it was like this, obviously for the cast and for the whole franchise. And I found it actually. I'd made this movie in this very intense, personal, lovely way with all these people I'd grown to know and like and enjoy being with. And then it's only when I actually went outside I realized, oh my God, this really is this popular. And somehow I filtered that out while I was doing it and continued to do so every time I went back to the studio, because the studio was not a glamorous, exotic, fancy place where people were acting like movie stars. It was a rundown airplane factory, and the roof leaked. We had to put buckets down to catch the raindrops coming in, and it was very pragmatic. And there were no prima donnas. Everybody got on with everybody else. It was a very real experience, and something that I've taken into all my other work. That aesthetic of working together, that we're there to do a job, to bring the best out of each other. And but then you go out at these premieres, and that's when and at the junkets. And actually, in moments like this, when you're asking me that, I suddenly go, oh, okay, yeah, I guess this is quite a big deal, a big audience. And we've done our best to honour and to make the films as expressive and as authentic as possible to the books, and within the limitations of what one can do. You can't make an 8-hour movie. You always start with the book without question. So that's where everything starts. And then I had a brilliant screenwriter on most of the films, a chap called Steve Clovis, who Jo trusts implicitly, and I do as well. And he's been somehow, I don't know, he's just incredibly gifted at getting the best from what Jo had created in the books. And but you always start with a book, and you always base yourself there. But then the same with the filmmaking process. What I find I'm doing at the end when I bring everything together in an edit on any film is you're always having to let things go to make the story, for the big screen, feel more in the moment. And it's, in the latest film I'm working on, I've taken out 3, 4, 5 lovely scenes that we nurtured and cherished and shot and edited and put visual effects in. And you suddenly you reach that moment where you realize the story survives without it and can actually thrive without the scene, is actually probably better without the scene, and you remove it. It's a process always of just trying to find the best version of the story possible. I say the first one is just having enough stamina to keep going, because the schedules are so long. And so therefore what you're doing with these bigger movies is, the shoots are about 26 weeks, 20 weeks, 22 weeks, 26 weeks. So it's just managing to stay standing up. So that's the first thing. It's just, and what I tend to do now before I do a movie is I try and really get into shape, get fit, get healthy. I have a lovely person who cooks lovely food for me, healthy food. So you really get into shape. That's the first thing I would say. The second challenge is one you've already suggested, which is, bridging the books and making sure that you end up with something that honours the book, but is its own thing, and making the right choices. Because we know the books are loved and people have their favourite bits and favourite characters. So that's always quite a challenge. And the third thing is just not being overwhelmed by the pressure, of what one of these things are, and dealing with the politics of it all. And the politics are politics with a very small p, but there are a lot of filmmakers. There's a curious experience that some of them have in our industry. A big studio will say to a filmmaker, we love the work you've just done. We love your short film. We love the piece of television you've directed. Please come into this world and do your thing. And then they proceed to completely control and sort of stop them doing what they did brilliantly in the first place. So the third challenge is always really building the relationship with the people who finance your work and getting them to trust you, holding that trust throughout the process, and really encouraging them to let go sometimes so you can do your thing. And I was very lucky with Warner Brothers. They were very supportive, but they would come at me with challenges, and it's all about how you mitigate those challenges and keep them with you, and how you persuade them to stay with you and keep the course of what you're trying to do. And that goes right back to what I learned at Essex University in my politics sessions, It's become easier across. Actually, interestingly, I would say generally it's always been pretty much the same. I've always been fairly adept at doing it, but I'm always aware that it's such an important relationship. I'm building a new film at the moment, which we're going to shoot next year, and working with a new group of people. And to me, it's very important to get close to them, to make sure they understand what I'm trying to achieve, and I need to understand what they're excited about and what they're afraid of. And I have only probably once in my entire career, when I did a piece of television in America, discovered this sort of machismic moment of a television company suddenly wanting to have complete control. And it was something I couldn't address with them. It was really weird. It was like, it always starts with a conversation, and it always starts with seeing each other's point of view, and it always starts with you trying to win the argument and bringing them with you. And they didn't want the conversation. And I learned from it. I learned not to work with them again. But it was a really and I found it really curious. And it was just a sort of ideology of working, which was about control, fundamentally for them, and a way of keeping that control right through the process. What fueled it was their fear of losing that control. It was a wonderful experience because I enjoyed making the program for them immensely, and they were incredibly supportive up to a point. And then I realized these guys aren't like everybody else I've worked with. And it was really fascinating. And every skill set I had in terms of wanting to get my own way didn't work in that instance. And I just walked away from that. It was just the way they did things, and it didn't work. We will bring in puppets, or we'll bring in an animal. For example, in Fantastic Beasts, we might bring in a little animal to represent a niffler, like a little gerbil or something, so we can actually hold something that's got a beating heart. And we have the most brilliant puppeteers as well. We've had some amazing... In Fantastic Beasts, the first film, the Erumpent, which is this huge rhinoceros, we had the most amazing puppet that was puppeteered by about 6 puppeteers, and it would come onto the floor and they would move this thing as if it were alive for Eddie to be able to, Eddie Redmayne, who plays Newt, interact with. So he had something, an eye line, the personality of this thing to be able to kind of interact with in a way that felt authentic. So we use all the things we can use, and we'll have, for the actors, we'll also have concepts, paintings of what the creature looks like, and we'll have sound. Sometimes we might have sound, so we can play a sound for them. So there are a few techniques that we can utilize to make these experiences feel as present as possible. And then some actors are just really darn good just looking at a tennis ball and making it look real. Yeah, they get well practiced at it. Oh, I love working with actors. Yeah, I love the whole process is fascinating, and every actor is different. So you have a different dynamic with every actor. Some are incredibly accessible in terms of forging a moment, finding a moment. You can share the most intimate things with someone about the moment you're trying to find, and it can be a very cathartic experience, just trying to land a moment or a situation with someone. And then I've worked with actors who are very closed and protective and who just want to do their thing. And no matter how much I try and guide or shape or encourage, I still get the sort of same couple of things. And then I have to try some tricks to sort of break them out of it. But, it's a fascinating process, actually. I'm not at all territorial. It's not about control. It's about the search for truth. It's about the moment that feels authentic. So if an actor does something that I'm not expecting or not anticipating, and it either moves me or surprises me or lands the moment in a way that I wasn't anticipating, it's fantastic. And I'll be the first one to go over and give them a big hug or thank them for that imagination. Equally, when you land a take that you've been pushing for, it's a real treat to see that happen. So it's not about control, it's actually about process, really, and getting there. And if it comes from the actor or it comes from me pushing the actor, I don't mind as long as we get there. I would advocate what you do is you make something. That's obviously the first step. And that's what I did. It was really hard to get a job to begin with. And you have to be a bit entrepreneurial and ultimately self-start. And I had to self-start 2 or 3 times to get my career going. So I would recommend that you either work with a writer or you write something yourself and you go out and you get it made. And you can make it on your iPhone, you can edit on your laptop. And I promise you could probably make something using those limited resources that will prove that you can do it, tell stories or not. And self-starting is probably the best way of going about it. And if you're a natural writer, even better, because I wasn't. I had to find writers to work with. But yeah, be a self-starter and be persistent and make as much as you can make. That's what I would recommend. There's a democratization of and an opportunity to tell stories with an iPhone, with your Mac. There were certain limitations to what one could do. A Super 8 cartridge of film lasts 3 minutes. You have to wait for a week for it to come back from the processors. And then this is a time for storytellers, I think, in so many interesting ways. The technology is there for you to do it. The times that we're living in are really full of stories that should be told. We're living in interesting times. And so I would, if like me, you feel this urge to want to do this, you should just do it. You should just get on with it and do it. Going to the cinema is that it's a communal experience. Sharing stories with a group of strangers that you know nothing about is always incredibly cathartic. By the way, I think the streaming thing is fantastic, and it's exploded in terms of the opportunities that's provided for so many storytellers. And I think obviously that's a major part of our future. But I would not write off cinema. And I really believe that big screen experience and what it does, not just kinetically and in terms of spectacle, but in terms of what it does emotionally for us and spiritually what it does for us when we share emotion together, when we share stories that say something profound that we can all relate to together and share. I think it'll come back. I may not be, it might have its wings slightly clipped, in years to come, but I'm cautiously optimistic. And we do need to protect the sector. There are certain cinema chains that are, in terms of, their business model are struggling, and you can't go to the cinema if the cinema chain's gone bust, but I'm cautiously optimistic that if that were to happen, someone would ultimately step in and people will still want to go out and see films on a big screen. Our film is still coming out when it was planned to come out a couple of years ago, so we haven't shifted that date to date. So it's still scheduled to come out, which is July, 2022. That's our release date, and we're sticking to it. For the time being, that's been on my calendar for 2 years now, believe it or not. So come July, we'll be doing that premiere thing again, I hope.